Richard, how are you doing today?
Pete, I'm doing wonderfully well still during the second COVID season. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. It is September and we are still living in Maskville.
Yeah. Yeah. I see it out there. I also see more people these days without masks, though, because, over time, I think people are a little bit more questioning. They keep seeing evidence to the contrary coming out
Mhm.
and studies. And even if the other side wants to say it's not what that study really says, there are people who are questioning, like, why are we hooking up our exhaust to our air intake for long periods of time? And what is hypoxia? What do they actually teach doctors and nurses about the long-term effects of wearing masks and what they should be careful of, right? And how are we going about recognizing that? Yeah, so there's a lot going on, but there are still a lot of there's a whole side of the agenda out there. They want masks forever. They're like
Yep.
the empire. They're like stormtroopers are a good idea. Let's get masks on everybody. There's another side. It's like, against that. And then there's like 50% of us who don't participate in those puppet shows. And we're all just like, what are you guys doing? Because the facts don't add up to the actions, and the reactions to the whole COVID thing seem to be more deleterious to our long-term freedom and our short-term economic situations than the virus itself. So, yeah.
Yeah, I shared on social media this morning 4 pages from a new book from school where it's a coloring book where you get to color your mask, and then the doctor says that you have to wear your mask, and then it shows, and the doctor's not wearing a mask in the picture, but mind you, and then it shows the kid and he's like, I'm wearing my mask. And it's designed for school. It is curriculum. Yeah. So, and people think this is it's going to go away after the election. I think that's one of the most blue-pilled things I've heard.
When did the TSA go away? Is there still TSA at airports?
I'm going to be dealing with them next weekend for the first time since this started.
Well, good luck. You're a brave man to go out there and deal with that situation, trying to fly interstate. Are they going to make you quarantine on the other side? What's the situation these days?
Of course.
What are the LARP rules this week? I'm not keeping up on.
Well, I'm staying with a friend. I'm staying with a friend, so I'm going to say, I'm quarantining at his place. I'll give his address, and then when I get there, I'll decide what I want to do.
Right on.
New York City, folks. New York City.
See it while it's there.
Yeah.
I was watching Luke Radowski's report, I guess, from last night about Portland, and I guess the capital, that area is on fire. It's just like there's a lot going on, and to have these things go on long term, I think Portland, like, that's been going on like 100 days, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what is the point? What is the goal? What does done look like? Is there any type of strategy or tactics involved other than trying to create a civil war in this country, letting one side go rampant until the other side attacks back? Because that's how you'd start a civil war. That's how the Civil War started here in America in 1861, according to the home letters of Solomon de Rothschild to his cousins and his brothers, saying, here's the description of what's going on in America with all the elites in the North and what they believe and why they're doing business like this. And they think that their brand of slavery is better than the Southern brand of slavery, because the North wasn't about freedom either. They're about, hey, you can be a slave worker in a mill, but you got to go pay your own room and board someplace else. So there was slavery on both sides, and there was arguments back and forth on defending it. So it wasn't like one side was good and the other side was bad. There was some deleterious situations and some rich and powerful and influential families that made their money from the broken backs of human beings on both sides, right? And so as long as we keep getting these cartoon versions, like just two colors, let's draw it in stick figures. Let's not make it too complicated for people. As long as people keep going from that cartoonish version of reality and making decisions about their everyday real life, that's not going to match up very well. Like, the description in the cartoon is not actually the description of the facts available and the causalities ongoing from these events. So people are really, they're primed for revolution right now for no good reason, with no good outcome, over a bunch of nonsense that's being constructed artificially by third parties who put tremendous amounts of money into crushing America, ruining its values, separating and disseminating families, crushing people's spirits, destroying their businesses. I could go on for a while, but you guys know what I'm talking about. This is going on. It's funded from outside. There are people who don't have an America ideal of, freedom and entrepreneurism and private property and these sort of things. There are people called globalists, and they want internationalism. They've been working for, that plan for over 100 years. They're very meticulous. They have a lot of working groups, and they are doing it all the time, whether we're paying attention to it or not. And what we're seeing today is like lockstep in their manifestation plan of how they want to roll all this stuff out and achieve the future that they write about in these papers. Right now, you can go read the 2050 papers, see what the world's going to be like in 2050. Does America exist? What are states and cities? No, it's all going to be reorganized by the United Nations Agenda 21. Now, people have been talking about this stuff for 20, 30 years. You can actually go still see today video of before all this global warming stuff, like how it came about. Here's the United Nations meetings. Here's Edmund de Rothschild standing up at that meeting and saying, this thing we should create, we should, put it forth. And then all these things follow for decades that go on beyond that. So unless people have the context to understand how these things they're seeing today were brought about, and how the this eco movement, the carbon footprint, and we got to do all this stuff, like where did those ideas come from, and are they for the betterment and preservation of humanity as a free species, or as a slave population to a bunch of people who have no right to rule over others? We don't have that right as individuals. They don't have that right either. That's what is missing. That and the contextual education and the knowledge of how to survive and thrive in this world. And if you put those things back, this would be a very different country in this time and place. But right now, with those elements missing, we are on a precipice of losing freedom on this planet forever, because the people who are orchestrating the ongoings that are like a caustic acid on freedom and liberty, they're doing it on purpose. They don't want people to have equal rights and equal opportunity and these sorts of things, to have private property, to make their own decisions for their families and have rights over their own bodies. They are making people guilty until proven innocent now under this new regime that's taking over the world, right? Through medical martial law. They are taking away thousands of years of jurisprudence and philosophy defending individual liberty and evolving to the point where we could actually have all this technology to even have this conversation for people around the world now and into the future to be able to hear this. So if we don't take action and do something now and look at these events seriously, then I think we're all at a loss, and we'll be asked later by our children or grandchildren, if we're lucky enough to have them, what were you doing at that time? What could have been done? And it would seem logical from that perspective, if these things are going to roll out, that, well, if people back then just knew, right? Well, that's what we're trying to do right now, is get this knowledge out to thinking people who can actually have some causal action in their lives, to be players on the field and not be spectators in this shitty script that they're writing for everybody and their family and their future. I think we could do a better job. Let's make their model obsolete, to use Buckminster Fuller's philosophy.
Well, you mentioned that people have been talking about this for 20 and 30 years, and that causes a lot of people to look at it and go, well, you can say anything 20 or 30 years ago, and then it just comes true, and you can say, well, look, I was saying that. But it's like we've talked about before. These are people playing a long game. This isn't, these people have a very low time preference. And most people have a very high time preference. So when they study things, when they look at stuff like this, they're like, well, why didn't it happen yesterday? If it's going to happen, how come it didn't happen yesterday? How come it's not happening next week? Well, you just don't know that these are people who are looking at how they're setting up their grandchildren to rule over you.
What people don't take into account, it's the same thing as like not noticing that the sun moves across the sky or the moon moves, right? Because it moves too slow for you to actually see it moving. But if you look at it over periods of time, that's why they use time-lapse photography to capture such things. You can actually see its path, right? They do the same thing. They play an intergenerational, like a multi-generational game. They call it the great game. The ruling elite, they call it the great game. And let's give an example, not in America. The United Kingdom, Great Britain, played the great game with its cousins in Europe. That was World War I. They played with China and crushed it for 100 years. That's not an exaggeration. The Chinese call it the century of humiliation. How did they crush it? Flooding it with opium, controlling people with drug addiction, controlling people with trading posts that turned into military outposts, that turned into colonies, that turned into colonization of their lands into the British way of speaking. At the time of World War I, the group of people behind this, and this is very, very well described and articulated and showcased in James Corbett's series, The World War I Conspiracy. It's a three-part series, and it's still on YouTube. Those people, their idea, their philosophy to rule over others was called the English-speaking idea. And the notion was they were lamenting that America ever got out of the plan, that America became free from the empire, from the monarchy, and all the societies and menagerie of cronies that facilitate that. The arms dealers, the drug dealers, the weapons traders, like all these people, facilitating martial law in other places, civil war in other places, in order to subjugate them. So in this century of humiliation, while Britain had lost in the War of 1812 to 1814. They go off and play with China for like a century. Then they come back and they're like, America, we're not going to beat you with redcoats. We've learned that. We tried twice. But we will take over your political machinery. We will take over your education system and turn it into a system of schooling. Education becomes schooling when you remove the free will and you also remove the tenets of self-reliance, the tenets of individuals, the tenets of private property and entrepreneurship. When you take all that away, you can make people pretty submissive and supplicant to the government tit, right? So in that situation, that's what I'm saying. It's been going on a long time. And as far as Agenda 21, these people wrote down their plan in 1992, and the meetings go back to like 1984 for that meeting where they wrote down their plan in Rio. It was the Rio United Nations Conference. When you follow back, who created the United Nations? You just have to ask the question, this entity, this organization, what is the institutional history? Who brought it about? For what purposes, right? The United Nations is built in the slaughterhouse district. Like that was built on a slaughterhouse that the Rockefellers owned that property and they had their architect build that international building. It's a front organization for people who subjugated an entire country that had a rich culture for thousands of years, by the way, China did. They subjugated them with opium. Now, I happen to have brought a few books to today's conversation, Pete. I didn't preface this, but since I did just mention the opium and the whole underlying current of those super rich families, those Eastern establishment families that still had a loyalty to Great Britain, I got a book here called Dope Inc. I got 2 copies of it, actually. So Dope Inc. Sorry for not having a book cam in the studio. Britain's Opium War Against the World. Now, this is a more recent reprint. It's a little taller, thinner, right? Here's my original, Dope Inc., and it was at that time subtitled The Book That Drove Kissinger Crazy, okay? Now, if you look at this, it's a substantial book, and I got a lot of bookmarks in here. Now, what's interesting in this book is it covers, in very academic manner, the history of the British use of opium and opium trading. And when it came around to running the empire with the opium money, they got into the 20th century and they had this problem with America and how are we going to reconcile with our cousins. Now, another unplanned point, this cartoon on the wall, it's called Hands Across America. It's from 1924. It has Uncle Sam shaking hands with John Bull, who's like the Uncle Sam for Britain. Right? Our Uncle Sam that we know that's like the army wants you, that's based on a British poster from 1915 of Lord Kitchener doing the same thing. So a lot of what we know as Americana for the 20th century was set up by our really close friends, the British cousins, who also created our intelligence apparatus, by the way, which also through us created the ISI and the one that they use in Mexico, DFS, that runs the cocaine. So there's a whole hierarchy of some very elite people willing to sacrifice other people's lives in order for them to have that wealth. And then they have front companies and organizations and working groups and think tanks and nonprofits. And then they have intelligence agencies that act as like the official fronts. But when you go back to like who started MI6, who were its first directors, these sort of questions, you get back to people who worked for De Beers, which was Cecil Rhodes' arm of the Gold and Diamonds, or the people that were running the opium, or the East India Company legacy left behind, right? The East India Company that used to run the opium, it went away. But all that stuff's still done today. The only reason the United States is in Afghanistan since 9/11 has nothing to do with 9/11 and everything to do with the fact that the British Empire fought 3 wars, the first, second, and third Anglo-Afghan wars, to preserve their opium monopoly in that area. And then they got their cousins, the United States, to kick in and start doing the property management of their empire following the special relationship of World War II. So there's a long train of abuses that have led to this point where they can perpetrate something like they're doing now, where they just turn the whole world upside down. If you're a criminal, pass right through. We're not going to hold, you just, killed a family of people. We'll just let you out without bail. They're just emptying and causing chaos. And when the DAs are bought off by Soros money, because that dude put in $19 billion, according to the New York Times, right? So the dude who put in $19 billion, according to the New York Times, and you could fact check me on that. I'll find the reference and put it in with this. He's also the guy who said in his book back in like 1992, I think was the interview, that he was the Messiah. Okay. So you got to do with a God complex and an obscene amount of money who just wants to see chaos in America. And he's like been pouring money into this country, buying off its judiciary infrastructure, buying off the press infrastructure, buying off the universities and the schools and all these other organizations that he funds, and creating straight up chaos and funding rioters to go to cities that they don't live in for political machinations that they don't understand that they're part of. So they're being used as pawns too, but they're getting paid a little money, and hey, it's better than the Trump bucks, right? So there's a lot going on today, but it didn't all just start today. And it didn't just start at the beginning of this century. If we have been blinded, we as Americans have been blinded to the actual and factual of our history since the National Security Act of 1947. Let me bring it all full circle for you. The guy who wrote the National Security Act, Clark Clifford, 1947, he's a Wall Street lawyer. So were all the other guys that were working at the CIA, because, that's how they get there. The British MI6, they're bankers. The Wall Street CIA guys, they're coming from the same type of cloth that holds them all together in that fabric. Clark Clifford, 40 years later, he gets indicted for running the biggest drug money laundering operation in the world at that time, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. What do you think national security is about? You think it's about keeping we, the people, and our rights safe and secure? No. It's about preserving the hierarchy behind all these political shenanigans that are shown to you by the agencies that they own, the agencies that they staff. CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, MSNBC, Fox, all those channels. Like, look up what was Operation Mockingbird and when did it end? What type of control did they have at that point? Let me go back before the CIA. 1917, Texas Congressman Oscar Callaway says, and this is a paraphrase, that the shipbuilding interests, basically the robber barons, the railroad people, the tycoons, had bought up all of the newspapers, all the editors, specifically at those newspapers, the 26 biggest newspapers in the country, and controlled what everybody, no matter what side you were on in the equation, what they saw, what they thought, and what they talked about, okay? When Carroll Quigley wrote Tragedy and Hope in 1966, he says in there, the people in power, they fund the capitalists, they fund the communists, they fund the fringe groups. They work with all these groups because they're controlling it from top down so they can do it on their schedule and get the results out of these seemingly random events that they are seeking while everyone else is lost. So, yeah, that's where we're at in 2020.
You want to go back a couple decades?
What do you got? Spanish-American War?
No, I'm talking about a couple decades from right now.
Sure.
we're recording this on Wednesday the 9th. I'm going to be releasing it on Friday the 11th, September 11th. And I've never 460 plus episodes. And I think I've referenced 9/11 maybe once. Never. Just didn't come up. So this Friday is 9/11. I happen to have become friends with Richard Grove. So I thought I'd have Richard Grove on to talk about 9/11. But let me, so I guess the first place I'd like to start is, how important is it to you when people start bringing up a missile hit the Pentagon, there were bombs in the buildings, World Trade Center 7 was obviously taken down by controlled demolition. How important is that to you?
That people say those things?
Well, I mean, when you examine what happened on 9/11.
Okay, so first off, I don't know what happened on 9/11, and I've looked at this subject from a lot of different angles. I know that there are some things that they claim happened as far as the official story, Osama bin Laden and hijackers and all that stuff, right? And then there's upper echelons of nation states, of cross-pollinated intelligence communities, of cartels, of a whole bunch of other people involved in it, right? And it's not either or, it's also and. Like the hijackers were part of the great game. The British, let me just I'm going to back you up a couple decades and then come up.
They were part of the great game, even if they didn't know they were.
Yeah.
Because that's
those proxy forces that they claimed were hijackers. Let's say that there's evidence that those guys were on the planes, because that's where I would start. Like in any of these conversations, no matter which side you're on, I would ask, how are you so sure? And what makes you think that? These sort of things. So I would start with metaphorically like clean desk. And like, where would you like to start with the conversation? Oh, you're going to say something about, if you bring out hijackers. Okay, great. So you're asserting that there were planes in flight. Those planes can be identified, that there were hijackers on board. There would be evidence of those hijackers, and that those characters named are the people that were on those planes, right? So there's a whole bunch of things we would have to check out first. But let's say we get to there. Then you would notice that those guys were all handled by FBI, CIA, MI6. Then you would notice, this claimed guy, bin Laden, he had a headquarters in London in 1996. That's the Mark Curtis books. Okay, so the Royal Institute of International Affairs is a function of Cecil Rhodes' Last Will and Testament. It is the sister or parent company of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, right? This guy, this author, Mark Curtis, he's a fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs. So this is like impeccable Anglo-American establishment history for them. In here, you can see that they had a tight hold on bin Laden. And how did MI6 have such a tight hold on bin Laden? Because they had been working the Arabs since they created the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. They had been working with the Arabs since Lawrence of Arabia. They had been working with the Arabs since St. John Philby, Kim Philby's dad. Kim Philby sold the Arab proxy forces to Alan Dulles of the CIA. The CIA inherited Arab proxy forces that were later used on 9/11. So even if you start with official story, I will show you the contextual history. It's like, no, that's not what you were like. Those are facts, but that's not the truth, right? So there's a sequence of events that led to 9/11, much of those things obscured by national security. The incident at the Pentagon, there was like 88 cameras. There's like a silly number of cameras on there. And when they came out with like the proof, they're like, and it just divided everybody. People in those three frames, they're like, I totally see American Airlines 77 flying 10 feet from the ground into the building. And other people were like, where's the plane? There's no plane in those frames. And then it doesn't make any sense, right? And where's the rest of the evidence, by the way, right? Why are you showing us something like out of context? So there's like a lot that came together. So how important is it that anybody thinks any of those things that you mentioned? Not at all. What's important to me is, are you just hearing what the mainstream media told people, or what continues to evolve from that story? Because it's not even the same story now that they tell people. Or are you willing to look at the events and dig into the evidence and go through and read stuff and think for yourself? Because it's more a test of consciousness and like, are you actually paying attention to what's going on? You know, when those buildings disappeared on 9/11, a lot of people who have never been there, seen them, like it's just a picture on TV, right? In my brain, it's like that's 220 square acres of concrete that just dissipated into dust in less than 20 seconds total. What just happened? Right? Like each floor of the building is a square acre. They each got rebar concrete. There's 110 in each one when you count the mechanicals at the top, right? And if you count the total time of them disappearing from the set, from the stage, like a David fucking Copperfield event, dude. And people are like, oh, it's totally normal. Jetfire does that. I'm like, okay, dude. Right on. You know, have at it. A couple years ago, we interviewed a guy who worked at NIST, Peter Ketchum. Went to New York. It was interesting, actually, because we did the interview in the studio of the guy who made the movie American Ruling Class, which is a fantastic, interesting work of art, right? I think his name is John Kirby. And his dad was a Rhodes Scholar. So when we started talking with him, he's like, oh, yeah, I know all this stuff. I'm like, how do you know all this stuff? He's like, oh, my dad was a Rhodes Scholar. I was like, oh, shit, dude, where are we? What are we doing right now? What are we? He's got like Emmy Awards in his office and stuff. I'm like, why are we filming here? Who is this guy? You know, I was excited because he made that movie and I thought American Ruling Class is a really interesting piece of art. But I was like, oh, this is like the other people. Peter Ketchum, he's a mathematician. He's able to take the data from the computer models and be like, is that actually matching up with the evidence in reality? And he found out when NIST did their study, what percentage of evidence, like they get, like they come up with a conclusion from a disaster. A building came down like 7 seconds and they took all the data from that crash of a building and they made a computer model and they told us what happened, right? The building crashed. They're over there making a computer model. They never checked the evidence. They never measured any of the evidence. They never sampled. There was no science whatsoever in their model. They made a model to tell a story exactly what they wanted people to, you know, whatever the people that run that place, who pays those people, said to do, right? That World Trade Center 7, the least known building that fell that day that Dylan Avery and Richard Gage just came out with a new movie on that. That building housed the CIA, Secret Service, the emergency headquarters for New York City. It was like those buildings were all like giant filing cabinets that they scuttled that day. Trade Center 7 had the Enron investigation, all that other stuff that people, poof, gone. Like Enron was like September 6th, they're getting busted. September 11th, no one thinks Enron anymore. What was it? September 10th, right before the event, Donnie Rumsfeld comes out and says, hey, by the way, the Pentagon's missing like $2.3 trillion, right? Bad news is usually delivered on Fridays, not Mondays. It would be the talk of the week if 9/11 didn't happen. But somehow that guy knew we could say it on Monday and no one will remember it by Tuesday afternoon. And he was right for a while, right? The other thing that comes into play is you go to a Pittsburgh Post-Gazette article by Milan Simonich, Simonich. I don't remember the date right now. And it talks about the part of the Pentagon that exploded that day had the people studying the accounting. There was an accountant department working on the missing money, right? So there's that aspect. Like there's a whole lot of convenient stuff. Like I interviewed Dick Gregory before he passed away. He got called before the event and told not to fly. The mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown, got called and told not to fly. So even if, because there was like a division with people who were doing research back in the day, and I never got into the politics of any of it, but the division was called Liehop or MyHop, and it was let it happen on purpose or they made it happen on purpose. Both are true depending on which aspect you're looking at. There were people who were making it happen on purpose, and it's an international, it's not just inside the government, though they had a lot of people and still do inside our government action, right? So it's an international force. It's like Spectre from James Bond. And Ian Fleming, he drew up the blueprints for the CIA. So we're not talking, there's a mix that they have made between like those stories, those things they're talking about that Ian Fleming's writing about. He was writing about a lot of real ops that they actually ran when he was at MI6, right? So there's a whole lot of history, and it ties into like pop culture, mainstream media, and it's a whole lot more interesting to get down to like facts of matters, like the evidence in here where it's Bin Laden having a headquarters in London. Like, why are we looking at Afghanistan for this dude? Why don't we just go and see where he was making all these calls and sending all these faxes from back then, recruiting, right? So another book would be Black 9/11, Money, Motive, and Technology. This would get into, this has a good part of my story in here, but it also covers Kroll and AIG and the underground drug cartel aspects, right? At that time, why did AIG have the largest private air force in the world? Why does an insurance company need a fleet of planes? Is it a continuity of Air America from Vietnam when they were smuggling drugs back in US GI bodies, right? There's an ominous continuity, and it goes on today. It goes up through Iran-Contra. Like, you got 2 shows on Netflix, Narcos and Narcos Mexico, all about it, right? But they're not telling you the truth. They're telling you like, here's a fluffed up, let's get away from the actual facts of the matter and tell you something exciting about it, right? There's a, if anyone here has watched Narcos Mexico, there's an interesting story behind it. And I don't think you know this story, Pete, so I'll tell you real quick. We, meaning myself, my buddy John Massaria, we interviewed a whistleblower a couple years ago in 2017 who was a DEA undercover agent, and he was the top decorated undercover agent ever in the DEA. He was in the longest gunfight ever at the DEA, and he has, as an undercover agent, infiltrated the Medellin, the Cali, the Guadalajara, all the cartels, right, on behalf of his government. He started out as a policeman in like Arizona. They recruited him. Then he ended up working in Mexico. So he worked as an undercover agent, gained a lot of trust, thought his quote was, when I started out, I thought my government was as clean as the driven snow. Okay, that's where he started. Then he takes us through. We interviewed him for 5 hours. So he tells us like the whole history. When he gets to the part where the DEA brought him in to be in charge of Operation Leyenda, that was investigating the death of a DEA agent outside the U.S. consulate in Mexico named Enrique Kiki Camarena. When Hector came in to investigate that case, it had been unsolved for 2 years. For good reason, because the people working around Hector were in on the kidnapping of Kiki. So to not go too far to spoil the series, it's a 4-part series now on Amazon called The Last Narco. That's a documentary version of it. It's the opposite story of Narcos Mexico, because in Narcos Mexico, they make the guys that killed the American agent into the heroes of the series. So you're like, Netflix is straight up showing, here's what the United States government would prefer you to think about these matters. And then you compare that to watching like the documentary, The Last Narc, and you can hear and see, because the witnesses that are in that documentary, they are the guys that did it. They were the state police that worked for the cartels. They were bought off by DFS. Like, you really get a good, clean look in there. And the guy who made it is Tiller Russell, who did the 7-5 and Operation Odessa. So, like, he's got some super solid, interesting documentaries. And this is probably the best one. So by the end of it, Hector was set up by his government, literally, like, told to do stuff. He did it. And then they're like, we didn't tell you to do that. And then, like, you know, they went after him. So he understood. So by the end of the interview, you go through the whole arc of, he was naive. He starts working. Then he starts to see what's really going on. Then they come after him and try to frame him. It gives people a good example, just like what they did to Bill Binney, right? The guy's, he doesn't have his legs. He's in a wheelchair. The man was in the shower. They raided him while he was in the shower, guns drawn, right? They do that stuff on purpose. It's not because they're strong. So in these situations, there's a lot to take in. There's a lot of history that we think, oh, well, you know, Iran-Contra, that was about Oliver North. No, it wasn't. It was about Rick Ross and crack on the streets and the destruction of inner cities. And the fact that the people on top of this thing, yeah, there is institutionalized racism. They are the racists. They designed it. They're the eugenicists. They're the ones who were like, hey, Margaret Sanger, you're doing some great work. Let's fund you and make you a fucking household name, right? So there's a whole lot of things that have been brought into our culture that we don't really need those things anymore. When you find out what these things are and what they're meant to do in our culture, you can separate yourself from them because you don't have to be like under the spell of belief when you can get knowledge, experience, and some wisdom from learning about your world.
Yeah.
More people could do it. They need to do it fast, though, because it's sliding really fast into despotism and tyranny.
Well, the problem is that people, even throughout all of this, when people have free time, they're not studying. They're not looking at, what sent me down this rabbit hole like 10 years ago when I started looking into mostly like Federal Reserve stuff, banking, was coming home from work and staying up until like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning reading, and then waking up at 6 and going back to work. And it just took sacrifice to learn about it. It took sacrifice to learn, how a mortgage works, what a mortgage really is.
What does it mean? It means death pledge. It's a French word.
Yeah.
You want a death pledge? Sign this death pledge, please. It's a whole different connotation when you start understanding words people are using every day.
What does attorney mean?
I don't know.
A torn? A torn to tear from? To tear people out of, to be able to tear people out of society? Yeah, I mean, it's all right in front of us, but no one wants to study it. No one wants to go looking for it. I think a lot of people are scared of what they'd find. I think a lot of people would get to the point where they'd be like, okay, I know all this now. Now what do I do? And they wouldn't know what to do. Yeah. And so, and I think that's like that's a good point.
What's the Oxford English Dictionary definition of terrorism? It might be like 2C these days, but it used to be in older books, like here's a legit definition of terrorism.
Yeah.
Government by coercion. It was government by coercion. Then it used the French Revolution as the example. And, it might not have been the first definition under the word, but all those are different meanings and definitions that go with that word. That's what dictionaries are. So some people used to be like, that's not the first thing listed. I'm like, yeah, you see how there's 6 things and it's number 3 or number 2 in that version, right? So one of the connotations as structured by the English language and the people who created all the infrastructure around us, right? The Oxford English Dictionary is reflective of that. Terrorism meant government by coercion, meaning it wasn't representative, it wasn't voluntary, it wasn't voted for, it was brought to you by, oh wait, that's what's going on in streets today, right? There's terrorism going out there. People pushing ideological, political ideas on people who don't want anything to do with it against their will, right? So there's like layers of it that go on out there as well. And how do we remain free and live in line with our values amidst all this crazy stuff that we were born into? And it's not all done in one day. You can't do all that learning. Like it's about consistent and diligent, putting in time to understand the world you live in and how to be the highest and best person you are and how to do the things you can with excellence that you can affect and not to worry about the things you can't affect in the midst of all that other crazy stuff that they want to shove down your throat on every channel that's out there.
Yeah, it's watching the rioters and the looters and the people who are going up to cafes and shouting in people's faces. And it's amazing to me when somebody has the opinion that that's a doing something on their own. That it's not, it's like, I did an episode, probably like 10 episodes back with a green anarchist named Bellamy Fitzpatrick. And we went over Kaczynski's writings. And I mean, and Kaczynski talks about this. I mean, he basically called in The System's Neatest Trick what's happening today in I think it's section 3. And he just laid it out, the 5 points of what's happening today. And he said, yeah, this is what's going to happen. And people look at that and they're like, oh, there's a bunch of socialists and anarchists in the street. And you have to think to yourself, well, they're not out there. Why are they out there? How did they get out there? Who put them out there? What is the plan? What is the end game? Why are there private people pledging money to keep them out of jail? Why are they doing that? Putting up bail for them. And nobody's asking these questions. They need it to be, even smart people need it to be neat. They need it to be, this is the bad guy and I'm the good guy. and not seeing that the bad guy could just be somebody paid to be doing that. It's something that simple. They don't even want to see, and that's pretty cut and dry. That's pretty white and black. And they don't even want to see that.
Well, look at Arab Spring. The same thing is like Twitter revolution, using social media, putting these ideas out there artificially and making them look organic. Like they're specialists at that. And Ted Kaczynski, he was an MK Ultra. Like he was an experiment, a walking experiment that they created and set loose on people, right? Dude of high aptitude for sure. And when you read through, like, what was he actually pointing out? What was he upset about, right? Like if he did those things, that's fucked up because he took away people's volition that had nothing to do with the causal things that he was describing in his paper, right? However, the things he's describing in his paper, a lot of people have noticed, oh, that's actually, like, he was hanging out with people who were enacting the plan that he just described in the paper, right? And it didn't get printed in USA Today and it's entirely like by accident, right? What is the USA Today? Is that a paper owned by the CIA and run out of not McLean, Virginia? It's Alex. Well, it used to be Arlington. But it's not a news source that does its own investigative journalism. That's what I'm saying. It's like it was a very interesting, almost as if they planned it like that, right? It didn't really take away from their script. It rather allowed them to have more invasive, all sorts of surveillance and policing and those events that happened in the 90s, like the Unabomber, like Ruby Ridge, or like Waco. They totally facilitated themselves in aggrandizing security, domestic security in the Clinton administration. And then that just went on steroids after 9/11 with the Patriot Act. People were just willing to be like, here's my freedom, please protect me from the men in the cave who are paid for with our tax dollars. No one looked behind the curtain. Like it's a stage that they've set up, and there's people out there that work backstage. They got a lot of people that work backstage and do those things. Those are people that sign letters for national security clearance. They're on the take. They're professional. Like, they'll lie to you. It's part of their job. It's what they have to do. It's what national security is. It's why they put people in Leavenworth and those types of prisons for violating that, right? So there is a system by which they can create many conspiracies as they want to, as the tax dollars aren't watched over by the Congress and the Senate at all. Rumsfeld proved. I mean, that was pre 9/11. You should see how many trillions they can't account for today. It's mind boggling. And then, oh, by the way, you guys also owe that national debt that they've run up in your name without mission or participation in it. Right? There's people who are like making commitments and obligations for other people that they've never checked with, and they expect us and our kids and grandkids to honor their commitments. We got to protect the drug monopoly that runs the world, everybody, but we can have a president that says, no, say no to drugs, while he's, his vice president's running the whole covert operation. And another thing, the vice president at that time was George Herbert Walker Bush, a very interesting character in history. His best friend forever was a guy named Felix Rodriguez. And if you watch that movie Last Narco, you'll see that there's a very interesting role that Max Gomez played in that story.
Well, let's get back to 9/11. There's so much we could go over. How about jumping forward to the 9/11 report? Why don't you talk about that
All right,
beautiful piece of work?
July 22nd, 2004, the investigation, like the Warren Commission for the 9/11 event, they came out with their report. And before I could even get it in book form, I downloaded it that day. I printed it. I started going through. I was reading it. I was highlighting it. I was really hoping that these people had come up with something substantial that reflected all the evidence that's scattered around. Like, are they using it? Are they marshaling it? You've got all these people that were there on the scene, the elevators. There's all this other evidence. Are they listening to those people? You got sick firefighters. They don't know why they're getting sick. What's different about this? These other things that they've been involved with. None of that in there. They really reinforce the official narrative, except in a few key footnotes throughout, right? There's some truth in a couple footnotes in the 9/11 Commission report. And then and so that's interesting. Now, first they wanted to use Heinz Henry Kissinger to be in charge of that. And the Jersey girls, these wives who lost their husbands, they had read a few too many history books, and they're like, that's not a good idea. So then they wheeled in this other guy. His name's Philip Zelikow. Now, he's an interesting character because nobody really knew what he was about. But he had long worked with Condoleezza Rice, and they had, co-written a book together. He's a real neocon, and he was so sure and certain about this investigation that's going to go on for years that he was thoughtful enough to write up an outline of the outcomes before they started the investigation. So, he was just trying to save people work. He's like, just so you guys know, here's the end that we are going to create from the investigation. So that's a problem. It's like if they investigated Kennedy and they're like, oh, by the way, here's the outline of your research findings, and this is what we're going to put together, right? It's not about, let's look at all the evidence, right? There's a great book here called The Hidden History of 9/11 by Professor Paul Zaremka of a SUNY school, a New York State school. I think he published this 2 years after 9/11 Commission came out. Yeah, it's 2006. All right, so in here are like a whole bunch of contradictions that should have been accounted for in the 9/11. There's another book I have over there, 9/11 Errors and Omissions, maybe by David Ray Griffin. There's several books that are picking apart the 9/11 Commission report. So they also have a cartoon version of the 9/11 Commission report, a straight up, here it is in pictures and cartoons, just in case it was too complex to read this, right? So they're like just really making sure people can access that official story. Now let's just start with the official story, because who wants to be conspiratorial, right? The official story has this guy, Osama bin Laden, very scary guy, right? He was mentored by a former Nazi that was funded by Wall Street and MI6, right? So they funded the Nazis. The Nazis were grooming Arab fascists. That network got sold to the CIA. Bin Laden was part of that network. So was Saddam Hussein, right? So there was a whole bunch of people that were groomed for the stage that they took, like, for instance, at that time, George Herbert Walker Bush, the father of the president, he had spent the night in the White House, and his son George is off at that school in Florida for the day, right? So HW sleeps at the White House, and then in the next morning, at the time of the events, he's at a Carlyle Group meeting. Now, Carlyle Group's like a big defense contractor kind of government organization that does covert ops. Who's he there at that meeting with? He's there with Osama bin Laden's brother. Okay. So those guys are both at a meeting together. Isn't that awkward? Hey, your brother just tried to blow up my country. What the heck, right? But don't worry. Those bin Ladens, they're all going to get flights back to Saudi. They're all got diplomatic immunity. They're all good. No problem here. Then you got the situation of Bush's other connections with the bin Laden family. They go back to the 70s. So George W. Bush's early companies, Harkin Energy, his money guy is a guy named Salim bin Laden, right? Also brother of Osama bin Laden. The history of the Bush family and the bin Laden family is deep and broad and relevant, and was definitely covered up by national security. It starts on September 11th, where the morning when the attacks are going on, the Carlyle Group was having a meeting of its board of directors. And on the board was a bin Laden who is related to the culprit of the terrorist events that day, according to the official story, as well as the father of the president at that time, George W. Bush, and his name was George Herbert Walker Bush. He was a president a couple decades ago, for those of you who joined this game in this century. So the bin Laden family working with the Bush family, not just on 9/11, but a long history of drug running, money laundering. Like there's a tie-in between George W. Bush being AWOL with James R. Bath, who was his money manager for the bin Ladens. And when you look at what were the accused hijackers, what were they actually? What MO does their evidence fit? That of international drug dealers. And does our country have a history of working with international drug dealers as proxy forces for black ops that are carried out under national security? Yes. And did the guy who wrote the National Security Act also get caught in drug money laundering for those cartels? Yes. So there's just stacks of exhibits of evidence that I could enter in. And then it's like in the middle of this, you got 9/11. Who is benefiting? Who insured the buildings? Who was benefiting from the payouts? How did they not get resistance? How did that guy get so much more than he even insured the buildings for? You know, if you go into Larry Silverstein, who owned the World Trade Centers, those were 3 of the properties that were remarkably attacked on that morning, falling into their own footprint, very easy for cleanup, and didn't do a whole lot of damage to downtown. So business could basically continue outside of the cleanup zone, except for the toxic asbestos and whatnot. That guy, he put like 500 million down and got paid out like 8 billion. Like it might not even been that much because he used investor money, a very, very small amount. And then he insured it in case of terrorism as 2 separate instances so that he could get paid out like that. That shows forethought. That shows planning. Then you cut back to what is the topic of World Trade Center 7 and falling into his footprint. Larry Silverstein gives the order that day. He's the owner of the building. He said, why don't we just pull it? Right. And you can't just go in and do that for a building. You can't just be like, pull it. Right. Like it falls down like that because you already prepared it to fall down like that. That's a stage prop. Right. So in these situations where the story does not match the evidence and that part's impossible, right? Oh, some fires caused that building to fall down. Oh, okay. All right. Same as those other 2 big buildings, right? Same story, right? You guys didn't even have to like come up with anything new for that. That's wonderful. So when the science and the facts and the evidence contradict the narrative, those are hallmarks of psychological warfare. Is there any history of that going on with our government, our tax dollars? Oh yeah. And who's in charge of all that stuff? Guys like Nelson Rockefeller. The towers were called David and Nelson. They were made in the image of the Rockefeller brothers, right? They were nicknamed David and Nelson. Who built them? The Port Authority of New York. Who's the Port Authority? It's an externalization of power by the people who control the 21 bridges around New York, right? So there's a lot of history that has gone on while people live in this country and they work real hard and they spend time with their families, go to church on Sundays, all that good stuff. There's other people who don't do any of that and can't relate to your daily needs, wants, or even the fact that you're a human being. They kind of loathe people like us, right? They have plans in writing that say these things in so many words about how they want to use science and technology to adapt young human beings away from parents, away from families, so they can be totally controlled by the state, by authority, by soon a cyber authority that creates a proxy so you can never even know who the ruling class is. That's what they want to design. That's what they figured out after people got guillotined in the French Revolution and after the ruling families got taken out by their cousins in World War I. Like those ruling families still exist. Look up House of Hohenzollern, one of the ruling families of Germany. See if that looks like a family that lost power or just quietly put government out in front of people so they didn't get attacked and hung and chopped up anymore, right? There are ruling classes on this planet. It goes back to that movie, The American Ruling Class. You want to see who they are? He has them in that movie. That's why it was so great. He's got Skull and Bones. He's got Rhodes Scholars. He's got them all in there. He's telling you, these are the people that run America. This is how they run it. This is their clubs. He takes you to the Council on Foreign Relations in that movie. That's why I like that movie, because I was like, this guy is actually showing us what's going on. Yeah, his dad was part of the cabal conspiracy that seeks to bring America back into, a world slavery position. So it's like we're on the precipice. We can either be a bunch of individuals who say freedom's better than slavery, and we can spread that word around to others while we're still allowed to, while we still have question marks on our keyboards. Because when you wake up one day and there's no more question mark on your keyboard, you're not in freedom anymore, Toto. Right? You can't ask questions. There's no freedom. No, they'll tell you what to think. Asking questions will be outlawed. Using reason will be outlawed. You're seeing, like, that sounds hard to believe, but that's their plan. And I would have told you this story right now a year ago about what's going on today. You'd be like, no way. People wouldn't wear masks. They would revolt. They would do something. No, these other people were scientific. They played with rats. They played with pigeons. Now they work their way up to monkeys and people. They're pretty good at what they do. But the key of everything that they do, they have to turn off your neocortex. Those animals don't have that. They run on stimulus reaction. So they need you to watch MSNBC or CNN or one of those channels. I don't know. Pick your fear channel. I don't know what your fear is, but if we're going to communicate, tell me where you're getting it from and let's talk about it. They're going to use that to turn people into automatons that just go out there and panic and loot and riot and destroy stuff that makes no sense. They attacked Rand Paul. They're like, say her name, say her name. He's like, I wrote the Breonna Taylor rule, the bill, the legislation that prevents no-knock warrants. He's like, what do you guys, like, you guys are like even too dumb to talk to, right? And those people were out destroying stuff, and they probably would have dismembered him had they caught him and his wife in that situation, because they're not turned on consciousness, right? They're running from the reptilian complex, the amygdala. They're using fear and emotions, and that's not good. That's not a good time in history. It's not good for freedom. Like, freedom came from not people being overly emotional, but being, thoughtful and philosophical about liberty and freedom and property and entrepreneurism. All that stuff. Those people that are protesting and rioting, they're against fascism. Great, then turn in all your fucking iPhones and everything. Everything you have was created by capitalist fascism, by, like, show me what communism produces and I'll make a choice. Not. Like, it doesn't produce anything. It steals from other people who produce. It's a wealth redistribution management system that is used top down by elites who never follow its tenets or rules. Take Bernie Sanders, for example, right? So until people learn about history, it's going to continue to repeat, and you're going to have more 9/11s. This COVID sometimes is like 9/11 every day, not with the death, but with the psychological warfare that it's raining down, and the belief that it's like a religion of mask wearing and COVID. And if you know that Gates funds Fauci and Birx, then you're an evil person and you deserve to be like looted or rioted. It's like, what? It's like, just because people are looking at it, it's like, this is artificially created. There's somebody orchestrating it, small group of people. They planned it out. Look, they had meetings. They filmed it. Event 201. Or you can believe it came from Pats at the wet market. It's all accidental. And it accidentally checks off all the fucking boxes on their list of globalist, New World Order ideologies, agendas. Just happens to do that. It's coincidental.
Do you really think that they had to have a 9/11 in order to justify a war on terror? I mean, could they have done something less than that?
Probably not. Probably not. I mean, they couldn't have done less than that. I mean, basically, it was what they said in their plan, which was called redesign. It was the RAD plan, reassessing American defense. I forget, but it was the 1999 PNAC document, Rebuilding America's Defenses. That's what it was. RAD. And in that document, they stated that in order to do all this great stuff they'd like to do with their neocon agenda of preemption, they would need a new Pearl Harbor. Right? And then they went on to specify. They talked about the Pentagon. They talked about the World Trade Centers. They talked about this stuff. Now, little known fact about all that stuff. First off, I would draw the parallel that Pearl Harbor had about 3,000 people die. It was a very famous attack on our infrastructure. Got a lot of people polarized, moving in that direction. And that the British MI6 director, John Cecil Masterman, in his memoir called The Double Cross System, states that MI6 knew that Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor in August of 1941. And that they didn't see fit to tell their American cousins because it would jeopardize their relationship. To know that our ally was running fucking spies that got all those people killed. And they sat back, and he wrote about it. He wrote it in the book. And it's the forward to it's by another CIA Yale guy, Norman Pearson, who was part of the whole institutionalization of the intelligence community in our universities. There's books on that too. These are all very credible facts about our world that are very inconvenient for people who want to believe the cartoonish reality, which is why they should not tune into my work at all. Pearl Harbor.
Is there anything?
So the one other point worth mentioning is, okay, so the Royal Institute of International Affairs created the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations has a publication that used to be a eugenics publication about race development, the Journal of Race Development. It's now called Foreign Affairs. Since 1924, it's Foreign Affairs. In the November 1998 edition of Foreign Affairs, there is an article. It was written by John Deutsch of the CIA, Ashton Carter, who later became Secretary of Defense, and a little-known fellow named Philip Zelikow. It talks about catastrophic terrorism before 9/11. It cites the Pentagon, World Trade Center, Pearl Harbor, just like the Rebuilding America's Defense report, which was written after the Council on Foreign Relations issue, telling like, here's our plan. It's like their plan book. I got like 40 or 50 years of their plans on shelves in there. They write it down for those who will read it in their little coterie of globalist, bravado engineers getting it out there. So in there's another article, and it's by Bernard Lewis, and it's titled License to Kill, Osama bin Laden and His Jihad. So in this one Council on Foreign Relations magazine in 1998, you've got a story about bin Laden and how he's going to take over the world. And at that time, he's being run by MI6, according to the Royal Institute of International Affairs, right? And in the same, they've got the future guy who gets called out by Mike Rupert for running CIA drugs, John Deutsch, who was also involved with the insider trading, management of the firm that did the insider trading on 9/11. It traces back to him, along with Zelikow, who in the future runs the 9/11 commission that happens to fit the story of the thesis he came up with. Like, how did Osama's a big fan of Philip, and he thought he had a good plan, so he used it against him. No, it's not how it works. There's a method behind the madness they're unfolding on us, and it's there for people to read and spread if you can find other people who can understand the mouth sounds we're making. There's not a whole lot of people, right? There's like, they got the goldfish 8-second mentality, and then it's all lost on them. They can't carry knowledge forward and actually make it actionable, right? So this isn't for them. But for those who understand, it's not just that one day and all the things that came after it. It's all the things they had to do before that day. Before they carried out 9/11, they had already killed Kennedy, covered it up, done Watergate, done Iran-Contra, done BCCI, done all these other things. Same people too, for like 40 years. There's a legacy from Operation 40 and the Cubans back in like 1960, Operation Mongoose, making assassination teams to overthrow other countries. Those chickens finally came home to roost, and they've been roosting here for a long time. What goes on in America as far as domestic and foreign policy is not a function of the will of the people who live here, and has not been for a very, very long time, which makes all of us like accessories to the crimes that are being done in the name of our tax dollars and agendas around the world. We still have troops in Afghanistan, Iraq, all these hundreds of countries probably. If you look at the facts, and where did we get all these bases? We got them from the British, because they're like, you're now our property managers, America. Get out there. Collect our rent for us. Protect our properties. British Empire still exists. The opium monopoly still exists. That's what Ross Ulbricht didn't know about when he created Silk Road. He didn't know about this book. Otherwise, he'd have said, oh, there's a monopoly on that, and I'd be digging into their monopoly with my operation, because those are the people who have the power to make a judge punish him for his philosophical ideas. It was not the judge's idea, though she's just a crony who carries out their will and gives somebody a double life sentence with $400 or $200 million fine for a philosophical belief, not because of any physical actions he took on this earth.
Before we finish up, because we're going to close in on an hour and a half here in a second. Is there anything else you want to throw in there about 9/11 that you think is vital, or something that we could even be seeing today with all of this COVID tyranny?
Yeah, and it's this, because I skipped a couple good meetings to make this interview. So here's what it is. The people who profited and benefited and planned and facilitated 9/11 are still very much in power today. Their agenda is still unfolding. They have not been hindered. They have not been challenged, because people don't have the wherewithal to marshal the evidence, organize, and don't have a platform big enough to get in front of enough people or enough other countries who aren't already bought into the plan to do anything real about it. They can have reinvestigations and, these courts and things like that. But the real justice comes from people no longer spreading the lies and the myths to their children. That the myth of 9/11 that they created, the psychological warfare myth that was unveiled or unfolded that day, that shouldn't be what gets passed on to future generations. Future generations should have an accurate understanding of where did all the tax dollars go in the 20th century. And since we can't ever answer that, where are the ones that we know? Where did they go and what did they do? Oh, they bought off the press. They fucked up our universities. They took over our foreign policy. They took over the defense contractors and got everybody on a path to take money in exchange for taking people's lives. And then during that time, they made our money worthless because Congress didn't have the right to outsource printing of money. Congress can only coin money. They can't hand the right to print something that they don't have the right to print themselves. So since 1913, going back to the Federal Reserve that you were breaking out there earlier, the United States has been in jeopardy of being taken over by the very international forces that the founding fathers fought against. And some of those founding fathers were on the other side. You know, they had the philosophy of, hey, if we could just get a central bank in here quick, we could just keep this kind of like Britain Jr., everybody, right? Alexander Hamilton and those characters who took the side, they took the name of the opposition to cast themselves as something that they weren't, right? There's a whole bunch of complex shenanigans that are never unfolded through our educational, like the school system. So you have to have your own individual educational path because there's a lot to learn. And I found myself like 30 years into it and finding like the map I was given by schooling and university is not accurate of the territory, and that things can happen if you're using a map that doesn't reflect the territory that are deleterious to your future, your safety, your well-being, your health, all these things. And when there's an Orwell quote, it's from a volume. He has a 4-volume set of letters. And in one of those letters, he says about illusions and how they can be maintained indefinitely, but they will always yield. And they usually yield on a battlefield, running up against something that they, get smashed against, right? So that people are out there, they'll believe, oh yeah, like the good stuff's going on. But when it comes to them and they see it's not, like for Hector, the guy we interviewed in 2017, the DEA agent, like he was believing, he was killing for his government. He was kidnapping people for his government. He was torturing people for his government, right? These are all things that he carries a weight, a burden for, now knowing that he was helping to enforce the things he was fighting against. But at one point, he also made that change to become a whistleblower, to sacrifice his career. And, the people wish him like, hey, stay safe. Because when you see, like, if you watch The Last Narc, the people he's talking about are still alive today. They live in this country and they are protected from on high. But at least in that documentary, the evidence is laid out. They are named. And how do I know this? There are transcripts. There were recordings of Kiki Camarena being tortured over those 4 days before he was dismembered. Those transcripts, those recordings, the CIA had, and they came up in the investigation. So Hector's listened to those, and the transcripts are in the Last Narc, like in episode 3. That's what you're seeing. It's not a graphic illustration, like it is, but of a real document, right? Like, so the people who did that, they wanted to know how did Kiki find their money? How did he destroy Buffalo Rancho? So these things in American history that went on just as Iran-Contra was going down, people who think they know because they watch the hearings on TV, like that's how you can go blind through life, just believing that stuff. Those hearings are a stage. There's shows that are being put on out there, right? So to be able to interact or to ask people who were really at these events and get evidence, testimony, and witnesses and these sort of things, that's where facts and the truth can come from. Finding what's there, what's the evidence, what are the documents that aren't being mentioned on 60 Minutes when they tell you, oh, Mohammed Atta led this band of characters and they all just needed to know how to take off and not land, right? How'd they get those guys on the plane that day? There's a good hypothesis that because they were all being trained by MI6 and CIA to fly drugs, it'd be no problem to be like, hey, go get a ticket. Like, here's cash. Go get on this plane tomorrow. We're flying you to an interview. All those dudes would be like jumping at the chance. Oh, we're going to be the next pilot flying drugs to the Saudi royal family, right? Look at the evidence. Look at the interviews of Daniel Hopsicker, who made like the Muhammad Atta and the Venice Flying Circus, which all these movies are being deleted. So the good research on 9/11 that's been made in the past 20 years, groundbreaking stuff, is now totally censored from the internet. Which brings up one last good point for this interview, Pete. This Friday, September 11th, the day you're releasing this, we are launching a website called grandtheftworld.com. And your work's going to be showcased there, Pete, along with a lot of liberty-loving producers whom you know, who produce content with integrity and references and substance. And I want to make it a place that when we see something that we know is valuable and going to get censored, that we can have a repository where you can have an editor enter it for you. If you don't have time, Pete, we can assign you an intern. But the idea that it gets preserved and then it gets backed up on IPFS, and that the people in the future get to look clearly at their past, because that was not an opportunity that many of us were afforded growing up. And we know how valuable that perspective clear into the past is, because without that, you can't make decisions during present for your future. And that's an essence of being human. It's one of the things they're trying to take away from us right now. So you got to ask the question, what force on this planet wants to dehumanize the human beings? I don't know, but it's going on out there. And until we start asking questions and finding substantial, verifiable, shareable answers with each other, we can't make a whole lot of progress. And so I hope that conversations like these and people out there living their lives, listening, watching, that this can help you dig in. Like if you just did one thing for yourself, find the hidden history of 9/11 by Zaremka, or get yourself NATO's Secret Armies about Operation Gladio by Professor Danielle Ganser, or Operation Gladio by Paul Williams, or Black 9/11 by Mark Gaffney, or Secret Affairs. Like go just dispute the whole Bin Laden, the whole story within, like argue with yourself. Bin Laden did it. Well, how do we know? Who was he? Where was he working? Who was paying his fax bills to recruit jihadis? Who has an agenda to use jihadis over the past 100 years? Like there are answers to these questions, and they're a lot more interesting than anything you're going to see pretty much on YouTube or mainstream media these days, because YouTube's like where you put media to get censored, I guess. Google has become a hiding algorithm. Who'd have thunk it? That the company that said don't be evil was actually like, well, that's for you, that's not for us. You know? But we got to laugh at it, because if we don't keep a good attitude, we can't create and innovate and use our ingenuity to solve the problems that they've presented us with. I think that being faced with these problems in our lifetime, JFK said, may you live in extraordinary times. And I think we do. And it's up to us to rise to that occasion, continue to develop ourselves and strengthen ourselves and like adult up, or like, put our, cowboy up is one of the terms. And that's what going through and studying 9/11 for me did. It took me out of a childish, extended adolescence belief in the world that there's checks and balances in our government, and the president really and the Congress and the senators are like making laws like we saw in Schoolhouse Rock. That's not really what goes on. There's lobbyists and they bribe our people. That's how it works. I saw it up close for a couple years when I lived down in DC. I got to see how laws get made. The senator, the congressman, he goes to the floor. He's got a pager. Chief of staff texts him, here's how you vote. He has no idea what he's doing. Flying blind. That was a Connecticut congressman, by the way. So in those situations, when you get to see like how the sausage is actually made, I mean, I should have known better than I think I voted once after that. But then I found out about libertarian philosophy from Michael Badnarik in 2004. And that's the last time I ever voted, I think, back then. I voted for him.
In 2004.
And now he's a graduate of this course, and he's just releasing his Constitution course. So that's also michaelbadnarik.com. Check that out.
Well, I have a page set up on my website, freemanbeyondthewall.com/autonomy, which has links for information for season 4, which is starting when?
All right, so season 4 starts September 18th for the global meet and greet. That's when all the new students enrolled get together and you talk to the graduates. Everyone has a great time. And then we do our first lecture for season 4 on September 25th, which is a Friday night. And I know right now that from people downloading the 19 skills document, there's calls that are generated from that. So I'm booked out for the next month solid on people interested in getting a blueprint and exploring the possibility of the course. But that being busy is a really good thing. And I had like 8 calls today, and this has been a pleasure to take a couple hours out with you in the midst of all the other things that we have going on. And I think we should do it more regularly, like every other month or so, check in, because I know there's a lot of people from your audience that are also in season 3 and season 4. And let's work together a little more consistently, if you got time in your schedule.
Right. Oh yeah, definitely. I'll make time. www.freemanbeyondthewall.com/autonomy. Thank you, Richard. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you to everyone listening and watching. Peace.